The following presentation was made possible through the generosity of the insurance firm of Lester Smart, Thurman, Tremmel, and Arndt, 210 9th Street South, Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin.
Here. Welcome once again to our ongoing series of the history of central Wisconsin. To assist me in this presentation, I've enlisted the services of my good friend Phil Brown. We'll get back to Phil in just a moment. In previous presentations, I've requested photos from folks just like you, and your response has been just great. Now, what you are about to see is one of the most extensive treasures of local photo history you could ever imagine. Enter the postcard collection of Philip M. Brown. Phil and his wife Mary own and operate Glacial Lake Cranberries in Cranmore. Phil is a collector of historic memorabilia, and Phil is especially proud of his picture postcards. Welcome, Phil, and tell me, what's this great fascination with picture postcards?
Well, thanks, Paul. It's nice to be a part of this historical presentation, and especially to be able to get these wonderful pictures of our past out in front of the public. You see, picture postcards date back to 1861, and a time when the government required that one full side be reserved only for the address. It wasn't until 1893 when the Chicago World's Fair marked a turnaround for the picture postcards. Illustrated cards of the fair were printed and sold as souvenirs, and the public fell in love with the picture postcards. The postage rate actually dropped from 2 cents to 1 cent, and thus began the golden age of picture postcards. But there was still the problem of squeezing a message on the same side as the picture. And finally, on May 1st of 1907, the government allowed the message to be written on the same side as the address. At the time, when there were very few automobiles, no TV or radio, and only marginal pictures in the newspapers, friends and relatives began exchanging picture postcards. Even clubs were organized, and every home proudly displayed a postcard album, cards with messages from their friends and relatives. A beautiful picture postcard with a message was often preferred to a letter. As you can well imagine, right here in central Wisconsin, the interest in picture postcards was just as vibrant as the rest of the country. We'd like you to join us now as we explore the fascinating photos and stories of our picture postcard past.
Well, Phil, why don't we start on the northeast side? We'll move south through town, cross the river to the west side, and kind of ramble on from there.
Great idea, Paul. And along the way, we'll make postcard stops wherever the photos lead us.
For openers, our camera is located in the 1100 block of First Street North as we go back in time with our first postcard photo taken in 1909.
This area was once a center of activity for Grand Rapids, second only to the downtown area. It was here that the first Wood County Courthouse was located. On the left side of the street, near the far corner of the Grand Rapids Brewery building, which was covered in our previous video. Just 2 blocks north, much of the activity was stimulated by the arrival of our first railroad in November of 1872, the Green Bay and Lake Pepin, later named the Green Bay and Western. First Street was a very important artery for the community. It was originally called Water Street.
Now let's do an about face at the same location as we face south and once again go back in time to the way it was shortly after the turn of the century. 2 blocks south in the 900 block of First Street was the location of our first municipal swimming pool, made possible through the efforts of the Arpin and Meade families and the young Consolidated Water Power and Paper Company.
This was the 1913 version of a water park. Water was supplied by the river. The slide was obviously built locally. There was no such thing as a store-bought product. Later, a second slide was added. It was in 1920 when this photo was taken, showing a fancy arch at the entrance of the swimming pool area. The gentlemen in the foreground from left to right are J.R. Reagan, a local furniture dealer, G.W. Meade, president of Consolidated Water, Power, and Paper Company, and Edgar Dudna, superintendent of schools. A persistent problem with the pool was that each year the spring floods washed away part of the nice sand beach. In later years, the pool was improved, as we see in this colorful postcard taken about 1925. It was in the early 50s when this pool was replaced by a more modern but less rugged version filled with nice, clear city water. But the new pool couldn't handle the winter weather. It leaked badly, was costly to maintain, and was finally demolished in 2004. This scenic area that was for almost 100 years was filled with summertime fun and laughter has now fallen silent. It was on July 27th of 2006 that this historical mural depicting the river's past and the pool area was dedicated. The mural was sponsored by Consolidated Water Power Company, Stora Enso. Now we move further south to the busy intersection of First and Baker Streets, our camera facing north. This 1910 photo shows the Arpin mansion in the distant left. The next white building was the Congregational Church with a steeple, which was later removed when it became the Christian Science Church. But the main subject of this postcard is the brick building with the clock tower, originally the Grand Rapids City Hall and Fire Station. The council chambers and public library occupied the second floor. Later, when the new West Side City Hall was built, the T.B. Scott Public Library occupied the entire building. Behind the City Hall on Baker Street was the Wood County Jail. Just across the street from the jail was the Wood County Courthouse, which also fronted on Baker Street. From this point, if we do an about face to the south, the jail is on the right, next the City Hall, and then the Armory comes into view on the left. The Armory was located on the riverbank in the area of the present-day clock tower, and was most often referred to as the amusement hall. In this interior photo, it is referred to as a roller rink.
Phil, notice the massive air-operated orchestra machine. These were predecessors of the modern-day jukebox. A sign on the post is quite blurry, but we're able to determine that it instructs gentlemen to please skate with their hats removed.
Right, Paul. And you know, this hall was even used for many local basketball games. This postcard shows the Armory all decked out for the July 4th, 1908 Papermakers Dance, sponsored by the International Brotherhood of Papermakers. It was on November 12th of 1938 when the Armory was destroyed by fire, which brings us to the early days of our fire department located just across the street from the Armory. In this 1920 photo, the boys proudly show off their first motor-driven fire truck. No more feeding the horses, and gas was cheap. Prior to that time, This undated postcard shows the horse-drawn pumper and the fireman with what was most likely a crew of volunteers, possibly taken about 1900.
Now we move further south to the present-day Jackson Street area. Of course, there was no East Jackson Street at the time. This is how the area looked. The building on the right was the Witter Hotel. Now pay particular attention to the arched windows on the second and third floors as we move to a later postcard of the Witter, and you'll see that an addition was made to the building. In later years, the building was extended even further north. The large Witter dining room was proudly displayed in this colorful postcard.
Again, going back a little, in this undated postcard, our cameraman was standing just in front of the Witter, and he couldn't resist taking this picture showing a wagon pulled by a team of 5 husky dogs. A sign on the post tells us that there was a pay telephone in the Witter for public use.
And Phil, notice the light hanging here. We used to call it the red light. If it went on, the policeman on foot was to call the station and respond to an emergency in the area. These red lights were located at strategic locations around the downtown, even in the early 50s.
Interesting. Another postcard photo taken in the same approximate area shows a wagon pulled by an ox. On the right is the Grand Rapids Plumbing and Heating Company. Remember that name as we move further south and familiarize you with our next Grand Rapids location as we again go back in time to the way it was. Here's where we were. This is that Grand Rapids Plumbing and Heating building, the Witter on the left, and an amazing mix of businesses all along the west side of the street. The east side of the street was also a beehive of activity. But the crown jewel of the area was the new First National Bank building constructed in 1906. The interior of the bank was fitted with all the latest banking facilities, including a special room for lady patrons, away from smoking cigars, noisy adding machines, and typewriters. A little further south, our camera puts the next picture postcard into perspective. Further down 2nd Street was Daly's Drugstore, which continued in business at that location until the riverbank was cleared.
Phil, there must have been a real estate office upstairs in the brick building on the extreme left. A very blurry sign on the sidewalk says, "We sell lots, $1 down, $1 a week, no taxes, no interest."
Such a deal. The street level of the building was Schumacher's department store. Later it became Barnes Candy and Ice Cream Parlor. Still later was the Sugar Bowl Cafe, featuring homemade candy, a soda fountain, and restaurant. How about this 1946 photo? At the time, you could order a complete dinner at the Sugar Bowl for just 35 cents. Just to the left of the Schumacher Barnes Sugar Bowl building was the first home of the Wood County Bank, partly visible in this postcard dated 1908. The Wood County was not to be outdone by First National, and in 1910 moved into this fine new building at their present-day location. Like the First National, the new bank was elaborately fitted to satisfy the most discriminating customers. turning to 2nd Street and backing off a little further, we get another perspective of this area.
Well, Phil, as long as it's so handy, let's take the old iron bridge and head across the river. But first, let me remind folks that the road in this picture is Vine Street, not yet Grand Avenue when this postcard was printed. On the left, of course, is the woodblock, which we've covered extensively in previous videos.
This bridge was built in 1889, and as we move across its two spans, we find ourselves facing west at the intersection of West Grand and First Avenues. Grand Avenue was a new name for this street. It had previously been called Cranberry Street. The Centralia Hardware on the left was later changed to the Nash Hardware. In its final days, 50 years later, it was our local Montgomery Ward store. Notice that in most of these picture postcards, Grand Rapids could already boast of streetlights. Now we move up the street a little further and explore the details of our next unusually sharp photo. This is an example of the photo expertise of photographer J.M. Colby of Wausau, one of the best-known picture postcard photographers in the state of Wisconsin. Moving in on the right, the first retail business is the jewelry and optical store of Brazo and Hannon, as indicated on the sidewalk sign. Notice the large eyeglasses mounted on top of the watch. It was once very common for jewelers also to be opticians. The last local example was Doc Weller, who did business on the west side near the Milwaukee Road Depot up until the 1950s. Right next to Brazo and Hannon was Otto's Pharmacy, which was well received in the area and enjoyed a very flourishing business. Upstairs was the dental office of C.F. Bandeline, whose son followed him in the dental profession.
Phil, old Doc Bandeline gave me my first experience in the dental chair. I didn't know what I was getting into, but I've been leery of dentists ever since. At that time, he was located over Church's drugstore.
Ouch! Next, the white wooden building was the original home of the Johnson and Hill Company. It would be just a few years later that they would move into their beautiful new store at 3rd and Grand Avenues. This view of the store shows that besides general merchandise, they also carried drugs, wallpaper, paints, and glass. Two of the buildings just beyond the Johnson and Hill building were the Bank of Grand Rapids and Frank Garrison's General Store, apparently a Johnson Hill competitor. It was in January of 1910 when the streetcar line began service between Grand Rapids and Nakusa, a welcomed addition to the local economy. Our next postcard view was taken from the opposite end of the street as we face east. It was taken prior to 1910 as there are no streetcar tracks in the road. The same can be said of this view from a slightly different angle. Sam Church's drugstore on the right was already a local icon like John Daly's drugstore on the east side of the river. Then came the streetcar line, and the postcard makers had to start all over again. In this view, a sleigh proceeds west as the trolley is about to turn south onto 3rd Avenue. And here on 3rd Avenue, we drift back again to the way it was. The caption on this postcard indicates that this was 4th Avenue, but the car line never ran on 4th. This is 3rd Avenue. And how about this unusual postcard with a metal trolley car attached? Obviously, this is a painted scene with no real connection to the local area. Now we move back to Grand Avenue for an exceptional view of the brand new Johnson & Hill's department store. This fine card shows crisp new awnings, pedestrians on the sidewalk, and show windows featuring the latest merchandise. This was Johnson & Hill's at its finest, the Marshall Fields of the North. It took 8 men to support this 27 by 40 foot carpet made in Johnson & Hill's about 1912 for the Masonic Hall, billed as the largest carpet ever made in Grand Rapids. Postcards were used for advertising too, as in this case with the January 1907 card promoting Johnson Hill's winter closeouts. Notice there is no use of the phony word sale in this seasonal price reduction, just genuine value. Further west, Johnson Hill's nearest neighbor was the Dixon Hotel.
Phil, we've touched on the Dixon previously, but there are so many fine picture postcards of the Dixon. Why don't we just flip through a few of them and kind of put the Dixon to rest once and for all?
Sounds like a plan, Paul, and here we go. Kitty corner from the Dixon on the south side of the street was the Julian Hotel. We've been told that Sunday brunch at the Julian was a very special treat. It was also in the late 1920s when the Julian ceased operations as a hotel. There was a short period in the 1930s when some kind of doctor came to town and was attempting to make the Julian into a medical facility, but his plan fell through and not much more is known about his efforts. Now let's move further west on Grand Avenue, facing east in this picture postcard dated 1911. The Dixon is on the left, the Julian is on the right. The people in the photo are standing at the location of the Chicago and Northwestern and the Sioux Line Railroad tracks where the tracks cross the street. Also on the right side of Grand Avenue between the tracks and the Julian Hotel was the City Bandstand. What a treat the music must have been on summer evenings for the hotel patrons, especially when you consider that there were no radios and Edison's 1877 invention of the phonograph was the only other source of music. The city band was very important to the community and was a frequent subject of picture postcards, like this 1908 view with parade uniforms and all. Later, when the new West Side City Hall was built on this location, the bandstand was moved to the East Side Courthouse lawn at 5th and Baker Streets. Still later, it was moved to Witter Field. When you have a band, you have to have a parade, and indeed, parades were much more frequent in the area than they are today. Grand Avenue has always been a parade route, and most parades started on the west side at the Milwaukee Road Depot and headed east to Witter Field. The occasion of this parade was the 1916 State Eagles Convention, held right here in Grand Rapids. It looks like the Wausau contingent stayed at the Julian, judging from the banner draped over the hotel sign. Grand Rapids was host to many state conventions back then, and a parade was always a big part of these events. In the distance is the Milwaukee Road Depot, which brings us to our next photo postcard. This was the first Milwaukee Road Depot. The Milwaukee Road reached Grand Rapids in the summer of 1873, and by November had reached Junction City. This much larger depot was constructed a short time later to accommodate the ever-increasing passenger business. In this view, we see the Witter Dixon bus parked at the depot, waiting for the train to arrive. The earlier horse-drawn Witter Dixon bus is shown parked in front of the Dixon Hotel. Same driver as in our previous postcard, a gentleman named Albert Walvogel. In this next picture postcard, we are looking at another very active passenger depot on Grand Avenue, the Chicago and Northwestern, the last railroad to reach Grand Rapids, arriving in 1901. Notice the water tower on the left. These were common to all railroad stops, always on the ready to satisfy the thirst of those steam locomotives. All of these, along with the coal elevators, disappeared with the coming of the diesels. Just across the street and about 50 feet further south at 531 West Grand Avenue was the Soo Line Depot. This south end view is how the depot appeared in the winter of 1970. Notice that the Grand Rapids sign is still embedded in the masonry. If this building were standing today, it would be located right in the Rapids Mall parking lot. The Soo Line was the third of our 4 railroads to reach Grand Rapids.
Well, Phil, we've made it from one end of the town to the other, and we've certainly missed a lot of things along the way. But we'll save those for our next video when we can cover our historical homes and the like, and maybe even get up into the colorful 50s.
That's right, Paul. We've only scratched the surface of our extensive picture postcard past. But before we close, let's give the folks one more postcard treat. Let's show off a few of the more humorous cards that once boasted of Grand Rapids as a great place to live and visit.
Well, as Jackie Gleason would say, and away we go. That's it for now. You'll want to watch for our next video, part 2 of our picture postcard past. I'm Paul Gross.
And I'm Phil Brown. Thanks for listening.